Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate, and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking. Is there any point in doing a nice thing if you can't flaunt it on social media? Can we ever know what it's like to be a bat? If we know Cinderella isn't real, why do we care about whether or not she marries the prince? In this episode, I'm joined by a man who might not know all the answers, but he certainly enjoys thinking about the questions, as explored in his best-selling book, Mini Philosophy, a small book of big ideas. That man is Jonny Thomson, who taught philosophy at Oxford for more than a decade before turning to writing full-time. I know him better, however, from his popular Philosophy Minis account on Instagram, where he regularly posts on everything from Kierkegaard to Studio Ghibli. He joined me to talk philosophy and fiction, including Tolstoy's morbid novella, The Life and Death of Ivan Illyich, Death and the Penguin by Ukrainian author Andrei Kurkov, and Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. But before we got into those, I asked him how he got started on Instagram.
It started essentially from when I was a teacher. We were doing some research at the time into what's called dual coding, which is this idea that people learn better when you accompany text with an image. I realised that my PowerPoints I was doing were essentially just like this wall of text. So I went away and I made some images for the text I was teaching, and then I put it onto social media. It only had maybe about 20 to 30 followers, most of my family and my friends, for about half a year, I reckon. And then I woke up almost overnight. Some account which had hundreds of thousands of followers had liked my post and they'd reposted, and I woke up with 10,000 followers. And then from there, it just span into a thing. And then the book came from that.
A lot of these ideas are quite abstract, but what I think you're very good at, and what certainly always gets my attention, is the way that you tie it very specifically to practical concerns, everyday concerns. I've had a lovely time dipping in and out of the book, which I feel like, to me, it's not something you'd sit down and read from cover to cover, although, of course, people can and should be encouraged to do that, maybe. Yeah. I love it as something that you basically have lying around the house, and whenever you have a moment, you just pick it up and you're going to learn something. And also, I think, be entertained. That's the other thing that I love about it. But I folded the corner of this one on Beckett, on Waiting Around, it's titled, because I haven't actually seen Waiting for Godot, but I suppose like a lot of people, I have this cultural idea about it and what it means. And I'd always been a bit baffled by it. And then I read your entry here and I was like, oh, that's what that play means. I wonder if I could get you to read it for us.
Have you ever been on a long journey with someone close, or had to wait hours and hours at an airport and found yourself inventing ways to entertain yourself? What do you do when even your phone gets boring or your eyes are too tired to read? What are those things we get up to when we're waiting for something else? This is the question asked by Irish playwright Samuel Beckett in his Waiting for Godot in 1953. Waiting for Godot has two men, Vladimir and Estragon, who are waiting to meet a mysterious man called Godot. Two other characters, Pozo and Lucky, flit in and out, but the play is mostly for the exchanges between Vladimir and Estragon. The critic Vivian Mercer described Godot as a play in which nothing happens twice. And he's got a good point. The characters are always waiting for this Godot, but he never arrives. The plot centres on what the characters say to one another in this strange limbo, and the play itself is about all those eccentric thoughts or behaviours we have while we're waiting for something else to come along. As they wait, Vladimir and Estragon clown around and they tell stories. They abuse each other and then care for each other. They seem to need one another. There's a farce to it that's laced with the absurd and the macabre, such as a character who goes to hang himself with his belt rope only for his trousers to fall down. They both seem to be playing and taking on roles simply because it's something that they'll do. They'll say, let's abuse each other, and then in the next moment they'll say, now let's make it all up. And it all mirrors life and relationships so well. Beckett loved his Camus, and it's not hard to see the influence of absurdity on his work. The characters are waiting for Godot endlessly, like Sisyphus pushing his boulder up a hill. John Lennon once sang, life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans, and how much of our life is spent just muddling along while we're waiting for our own Godot. Godot could easily represent our quest for finding any meaning in life. We could be waiting for true love, liberation, a change of direction, a religious epiphany, or perhaps even death. Life is the routine or farce of busying ourselves as we wait for some abstract and mysterious future. And before we know it, the curtain's coming down.
And that's just life, isn't it? We just... are always waiting for something. We don't quite know what, this thing that we think is going to happen, or someday the conditions will be right and I'll do this or whatever. And we spend so much of it waiting without really even necessarily realising that that's what we're doing.
Yes.
Unless, you're one of these people who you feel maybe are the people who've nailed it, who are just out there doing stuff. And anyway, I just love the way that got me thinking about all of that, and that haven't even seen the play, but now I feel like I have a really good understanding of what it means.
It's interesting, that play, actually, and that entry, because maybe some of the books we're going to talk about today are of a similar theme. The Beckett play, when you're watching it, you're not sure what value judgment to make about it, really. You kind of think, is this a good life? You kind of think something's wrong about it. It's a limbic stage of waiting around. And yet, a lot of the philosophers you read talk about happiness as being an accompanying thing to doing other things. So the examples there where they're basically prattling around, joking with each other, that happens because they're waiting for something else. And there is this element where happiness does come along in the moments when you are doing something else. If you consciously try to commit to a happy action, it's just not going to be happy. It's going to be weird. It's going to be forced. So in the way we're waiting for Godot, but that's just life. We're doing other things, and happiness is just something which pops up along the way.
I was thinking that unless you happen to have studied it in school, or maybe you did some art subject at university and so that was some kind of component of your studies, it's entirely possible to go through life and not be exposed to schools of philosophy, philosophical ideas. Probably a broad amount of people have a sense of who the key figures are and maybe some vague sense of what was important about their ideas, but actually not really know because they've never really been exposed to it. And I was interested in the way that it's like making it relevant, and suddenly it's really helpful to know that this person, I don't know, Marx, for example, who you've got some vague idea that it's something to do with economics and capitalism, but what is that really?
Yes,
actually, absolutely. It's helpful.
Yeah. There's an expression in psychology called emotional granularity, which is the idea that once you have a word for an emotion, for example, you can better experience and understand that emotion. And I think the same is true absolutely for philosophy. I genuinely believe that everyone is a philosopher of some sort. So I think everyone either has these thoughts, or they have late night conversations, or maybe they're reading a book and they have these philosophical thoughts and they just don't have the words or the kind of tools by which to recognise them and pull them out and analyse them. Hopefully mini philosophy on that account does that. It pulls them out and analyses them.
There's an entry in here, Radford, on fiction. It says, we all know that Hedwig, Cinderella and Frankenstein aren't real. They're fictional characters after all. So why then do we get sad or scared when we read about them? If we know these things are just make-believe, what makes us emotionally connect to them? How and why do we have real feelings for fake things? This is known as the paradox of fiction. You see, it had a term. Turns out that thing had a term. And it was explored in recent times by English philosopher Colin Radford. According to Radford, the near universal and very human emotional response to fictional works is irrational, incoherent and inconsistent. It seems to be a case of mental doublethink, to use an Orwellian term, or cognitive dissonance, where our behaviours do not align with our beliefs. Put simply, the paradox runs like this. Number 1, to emotionally connect to something, we have to believe it's true. Number 2, we know that fictional works are not true and the characters don't exist. Number 3, we emotionally connect with fictional works. There seems to be a contradiction. We clearly know that movies are fake, and we even comfort ourselves and each other by saying, don't worry, it's not real. But that doesn't stop The Shining being scary, or Bambi's mum's death making us cry a lot.
Yeah, that is a really interesting area, because we have this expression, the suspension of disbelief. I grew up loving fantasy stories, like Lord of the Rings. I grew up on Lord of the Rings. And of course, I know elves don't exist, I know dragons don't exist. You suspend disbelief, but obviously not too far, because I don't believe that dragons exist in the real world. But yet, when I'm reading that book, obviously I relate and I empathise with them. Tolkien wrote a great short essay called On Fairy Stories. He believes that when you read fantasy, particularly he thinks, but I think it's true for most books, that you do what's called subcreation, that you've created this alternative universe in your head, and you've entered in there and you're living in there. It's as real as you want it to be in that act of subcreation. And then, of course, you put the book down and you enter this world again. And it's a world-creating form, and I think that's really important. That's why you empathise. But, of course, there's a line, isn't there? That's the weird thing about that entry, that while we empathise with these characters and we suspend our disbelief, we don't suspend it too far, because I think I mentioned later on that if I thought the Death Star was going to blow up the planet, I'd be a gibbering wreck. It's a weird psychological thing that we can enjoy books without being traumatised by books, I don't think.
And it's all interrelated, isn't it? There's that idea you talk about in another entry about catharsis.
Yes.
Who was that?
Yeah, that's Aristotle.
Aristotle.
Yeah.
Which we talked about actually when Ella Bertude came on the podcast. She is a bibliotherapist, so someone who specialises in thinking about prescribing books to help people with very specific things that they might be going through in their lives or things that they might particularly want to think about or have help with. And that idea is very important to her, this idea that through this connection to books, you can almost like get all these emotions out of the way, but in like this sort of fictional safe space.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true.
I feel slightly resentful sometimes as a person who reads a lot about the amount of stuff I feel like I just carry around with me as a result of having read all these books. I mean, anyone who's read Cormac McCarthy's The Road will know the feeling of resentment that I have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Having basically lived through this just awful, like the most depressing of apocalypses. I've read other post-apocalyptic novels that weren't nearly as depressing as that one. Although there is, in a plot spoiler, I feel a bit of a flicker of hope at the end.
I tend to avoid overly depressing novels now.
I think very wise.
Exactly, absolutely, yeah.
And yet, there are these truths. And that book is absolutely extraordinary at the way it excavates this relationship and this bond between a father and son and really pulls apart some questions about humanity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the things that keep people going. And while it's terribly difficult to read about all of that, there are a few other things I can think that I've read where I felt it was so beautifully and profoundly expressed.
Yes.
And so if you want that, if you want to get to that, this is what you have to go through.
Absolutely. And one of the books we might have time to talk about, the Tolstoy book, The Death of Ivan Illyich, of course, that's a very depressing book as well.
Well, let's move on to those. So I asked you to have a think about some books that might express particular philosophical ideas or might be good ways into thinking about philosophical concepts. You gave me 3. We've got Death and the Penguin by Andrei Kurkov, the Ukrainian author. We've got The Life and Death of Ivan Illyich by Leo Tolstoy. And we've got Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. Yes. So I'm dying to hear how these books deal with these different concepts. Which one should we start with?
Well, should we do the Tolstoy now?
Okay.
We start with Tolstoy. These are books which have stood out from my reading history. Why do I remember them? And they all actually have a theme of loneliness, which is really interesting in different ways. Tolstoy's book opens at a funeral scene of this main character who's called Ivan Illyich. And the rest of the book is essentially flashbacks about his life, which is your cliched life of pretense and social etiquette. And his life is entirely lived according to what it ought to be. He becomes a judge and even marries because that's what people expect him to do. And he has kids because that's what he's expected to do. And the whole book is like a retrospective look at his life from his deathbed. Because essentially he's regretting his life. He's thinking, what have I done? I've wasted all of this time doing things for other people, really, because it ought to be so. And at no point have I actually lived in an existential, authentic way. And it's lonely because much of the book is from the view of Ivan Illyich, who is in his deathbed, and no one wants to be with him. The only person who sees him is the son of a local farmer, maybe.
Yeah, is it Georgi or something?
Yeah, that's it. He's the only one who is, A, honest with Ivan in his deathbed, but also, B, has this philosophically honest view that basically all things are mortal, memento mori, everything will die. And that's really valuable to Ivan on his deathbed. So when I do my first ever lesson with my sixth formers, I used to do, I say to them, I don't go a day without thinking about death. And they all think I'm being terribly morbid. They laugh about it and say...
Sixth formers?
Yeah, well, exactly.
You say that to a 50-year-old and they're like, yeah, me too.
Exactly, every day. I think like that. Yeah, and of course they laugh. And you're right, actually, to be honest. I read this book, Tolstoy's book, when I was 18, and that didn't resonate at all. Because 18, that's the height of life, isn't it? You're drinking and you're going out and you're having fun with friends, and, you know, rightly. And then I reread it for a post I did, and every note struck a lot more. And I just think about that lonely moment of death. When I reflect on it, it is an ultimately lonely act, that no matter what you've collected throughout your life, no matter how many friends and family and the deepest relationship you possibly have, death is you on your own facing this experience. And it's a very lonely experience. And that's what I find the book's very unsettling, because it does project you into that moment of you cannot take anything with you. It's just you facing your own mortality in a bed and no one else acknowledges it. It is powerful.
It's Tolstoy, so it's not a hard read because he writes so beautifully. Yeah. It's quite an intense read, and I took from it the idea that at the end it's about him coming to terms with the enormity of the idea of his own death, which is something that we are almost programmed not to think about. I think you wrote about this somewhere recently, just thinking about naturally we're optimists.
Yes.
We tend to look on the bright side. If we didn't, we probably wouldn't do anything, ever. It makes sense from an evolutionary point of view that we would be programmed to think positively. But this is the ultimate thing that you can't really think positively about, you know. Yeah. There's no upside.
The takeaway message from Tolstoy is, essentially carpe diem, live your best life, embrace the moment, be happy in the now, don't concern yourself with the trivialities of other people's opinions. But then, of course, a life lived entirely like that, it's hard to imagine what that would look like. You can't ignore death, but also you can't obsess about death, can you?
There was a wonderful article by Mary Beard in the New Yorker, which I really enjoyed. And what was really interesting about that was looking a bit at whereabouts Tolstoy was in his life when he wrote it. He was, I think, about 55 when he wrote this. And he actually went on to live, I think he was 85 when he died. So it wasn't an immediate prospect at that moment in his life. The translator, Peter Carson, I was really interested to read and learn about him. He was editor-in-chief at Penguin and also spoke different languages and translated. And the haunting thing is that he, when he translated this book, apparently had received a diagnosis of a terminal illness.
Oh, wow.
And so the Peter Carson translation of this work has this resonance, if you know that. And I mean, can you get that from the translation? I don't know. But I found that really haunting when I read that. He was apparently very pragmatic about it and said that he didn't really feel it had made any difference to his translation whatsoever.
But it's interesting. I mean, that raises a deeper question in itself in terms of like knowing the biographies of either an author or a translator, in that instance, how that affects your reading of the book, isn't it?
I did love this. Nicholas Lessard, writing in The Guardian, calls it one of the most lacerating works of literature ever written, a hard, pitiless stare into the abyss, not just of death, but of human nature. So, beach reading.
Yeah, that's it, exactly that.
But it's short and it's Tolstoy, and I really felt like, once read, it's going to lodge in your mind in, I think, a helpful way.
So that's the loneliness of death. I'm glad you invited me here.
All right,
today.
From one death, let's come on to Death and the Penguin.
Death and the Penguin. By
Andrei Kurkov, who's a Ukrainian author. It's translated from the Russian by George Bird. All that stands between one man and murder by the mafia is a penguin. Victor is an aspiring writer in Ukraine with only Misha, his pet penguin, for company. Although he would prefer to write short stories, he earns a living composing obituaries for a newspaper. He longs to see his work published, yet the subjects of his obituaries continue to cling to life. But when he opens the newspaper to see his work in print for the first time, his pride swiftly turns to terror. He and Misha have been drawn into a trap from which there appears to be no escape. A touchstone of Ukrainian literature, Kurkov's chilling, tragicomic tour de force about a writer of obituaries and his pet penguin moves through post-Soviet moral chaos on the wings of pitch-black comedy, whilst giving a bird's-eye view of the visceral tragedy at its heart. The New York Times called it a striking portrait of post-Soviet isolation. In this bleak moral landscape, Kurkov manages to find ample refuge for his dark humour. So, what's going on in Death and the Penguin?
The penguin is so important in that book.
It's not a metaphorical penguin.
It's a real emperor penguin. So the idea is that Kiev Zoo ran out of money when the Berlin Wall collapsed, and they said to people, take an animal or they're going to die. And so he took an emperor penguin home, and it's living with him in his flat, and he occasionally puts it in the bath or he throws fish to it. It's this constant background presence, this penguin, and it makes everything in the book a little bit surreal and a little bit absurd. I mean, the things he does anyway are surreal and absurd, the whole story. So he's an obituarist for a newspaper. He's tasked with writing obituaries for famous people in Ukraine. And what he finds is the people he's writing obituaries for are being killed not long after he writes the obituaries. But in the background, there's always this penguin, and it acts as a metaphor for his own life and for his own isolation and loneliness. But also it just adds a surreal element to so many walks of life. We find ourselves in situations which are at first very serious, very sad, very solemn. And there's just something which is very absurd in it. And if you look at it in the right light, it just makes you want to laugh. And the penguin is a metaphor for that. It's very Kafkaesque in that respect. It's about loneliness. Right at the start of the book, Kurkov mentions that Victor is lonely and the penguin is lonely, but they don't give each other company. They basically cohabit without ever crossing lives. At no point do they form a connection. I listened to an interview with Kurkov, and he said that the Soviet Union, for all its faults, Soviet Ukraine was very community-based, very interconnected. It was all about relationships, because if you don't have anything else, all you have is your friendships. And he said when the Berlin Wall collapsed, there was this complete disconnect with each other and dissolution of that interconnectedness. And the penguin represents that. Or used to be a community animal is now on its own, isolated. And I think it's just a really interesting window into loneliness again. It's all about the stage of life, isn't it? I think when you come to certain books, I genuinely believe that most, or if not all of the books are called classics, or even philosophers or authors, they are classics, but you just need to be in the right place to read them. I think it's definitely true for philosophers. I find that with Simone de Beauvoir, for example, and Sartre, and these existentialist French philosophers. I touched them at school because I felt you should, because they're like these feather-in-the-cap philosophers, and I didn't get them at all. And I read them more recently, and yeah, absolutely sticks. And I think the Russians, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, are like that as well. And people like Dickens and even Shakespeare. We throw Shakespeare at students who, most of them are massively ill-prepared to understand.
That's the thing. It's like the time in our lives where we have the chance to learn all this stuff is the time when, okay, fine, our minds might be like sponges at that point, which is great. But we're not bringing anything to it. This came up recently when we were talking about a book we did on John Donne, which most people encounter the poetry of John Donne when they're at school. And they have to read it and learn it and be examined on it. And it's like, you're not going to get anything about what's incredible about John Donne if you don't have the life experience to bring to it. Once you've lived a bit and you've been through some of life's vicissitudes, suddenly it completely comes alive. But it's like you have to get to that point. But, I don't know, what are we saying? That there's no point reading anything until you're ready for it? I just think you have to just keep reading the stuff. I often think about this. Now my children are going to school. And I'm so wistful about this chance that we had in our lives where every day we would go off and just sit there and people would teach us stuff all day.
Absolutely.
And you get lunch and then you come home. And it's like, my God, what a gift that would be, But at the time, when you're young, you didn't appreciate it. You just want to get through it. You're like waiting for it to end, basically, aren't you?
Absolutely.
Kind of Samuel Beckett. You're in that mode the whole time.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's necessarily all books you should definitely put off until you're old and stuff. But I think at least some books, if you don't necessarily get it straight away, I think maybe if you have time, return to them later on.
Let's come on to our third book. Now, I have never read Eleanor Oliphant Is Completely Fine. Right. I am a little bit allergic to books that are that popular.
Yes.
Only because I'm wary of being disappointed, and I've been disappointed too many times. But it was a huge hit. It clearly resonated with a lot of people. The back of the book tells me, Eleanor Oliphant has learned how to survive, but not how to live. She leads a simple life. She wears the same clothes to work every day, eats the same meal deal for lunch every day, and buys the same 2 bottles of vodka to drink every weekend. Eleanor Oliphant is happy. Nothing is missing from her carefully timetabled life, except sometimes everything. One simple act of kindness is about to shatter the walls Eleanor has built around herself. Now she must learn how to navigate the world that everyone else seems to take for granted, while searching for the courage to face the dark corners she's avoided all her life. Change can be good, change can be bad, but surely any change is better than fine? Eleanor Oliphant is not, I don't want to use the word normal, because what does that mean? But she doesn't fit into the usual patterns of how people live and behave. Is that right?
Right, yes. Gail Honeyman says she never wrote the book with her intending to have any kind of structural mental health conditions. She said it was all nurture, that her life had led her to be the person she was. The reason I like it is that it focuses on an area of loneliness that I don't think is getting a lot of focus today. We are more, as a culture, aware of loneliness, but particularly with the elderly, I'd say. People who are on their own, who either partners have died or they themselves, their kids have left the house maybe and they're living on their own in the house. I think we're much more attuned to that. But essentially this book's about millennials. I don't know if it's in the book or whether Gail Honeyman said in her interview, she said that there's this moment where you leave your office at 5 p.m. on the Friday and you go without seeing another human being until Monday. Just 2 days on your own in a house, which is lonely. And a lot of people suffer under that. So that's one reason I like the book. The other reason is that there's this character called Raymond in it, who is, as you said, there's a small act of kindness, but I'd argue he's a huge act of kindness. He's just a really decent, nice, genuine human being, and he befriends Eleanor. And I really like it for 2 reasons. One is I don't feel as though those kind of characters are explored or fleshed out enough in books. Just nice people. And I do think, I pretend I'm a cynic, but at heart I think I'm more of an optimist. I do think that most people are good. And this character, Raymond, is a nice guy, and he helps Eleanor. I can't spoil the book too much. I don't think it's spoiling it to say that it's left on a cliffhanger. I always read the book as being a slightly platonic relationship. They're just friends. And the other reason is I think, well, we were mentioning earlier about Tolkien, that essay he wrote called On Fairy Stories. And in that, he mentions this idea called a eucatastrophe. A eucatastrophe is a moment which is a catastrophe, but it's for the good. It's an act of grace which completely changes things in the story. And Raymond is that eucatastrophe in the story. Things are middling along, and Eleanor's obviously very unhappy. She pretends she's not, but her life is very lonely. And then Raymond comes along as this eucatastrophe. And it's a very positive book about how a single act can completely transform a life for the better. A lot of the books I've read in the past are about the opposites of that, the moments where life is completely changed for the worst. In fact, I've written on my Instagram quite a few times about that. These moments in life where, let's say, you feel a lump in the shower and it's diagnosed as cancer, or your partner's cheating on you, or you get fired from your job. These catastrophic moments which completely change your direction in life. But I don't think a lot of focus is focused on the opposite of that, which is these eucatastrophe moments, which something massively positive comes along. You meet a partner, or you get an all clear, or you get a promotion at work. And Eleanor Oliphant is about that. It's about the amazing transformative power of a eucatastrophe. A happy person, a good person has come into her life and changed it for the better. And I think that's a really good book for that. I wish we were all more aware of that.
A eucatastrophe. I hadn't heard that term before. This has totally sold Eleanor Oliphant as completely fine to me. Now I understand why so many people liked it. That sounds like something I would love. I wonder if you'd like... I read a book a long time ago by an Irish author called Rónán Hession called Leonard and Hungry Paul.
Right.
And that is a very quiet book about some very ordinary, decent people, two men who are friends, and a little bit about their families and their lives and the things that go on. And it's just all about these ordinary relationships presented in this everyday way. I suppose because I am so used to reading gritty, demanding, emotionally wrenching fiction all the time. I was a bit impatient with it because I was just like, this is like my life. I don't need to read about this.
Yes, true.
But as you say, it's interesting because, of course, what sells stories and what people want to read are those moments of high drama. And actually, there aren't that many books that really focus on this quiet, everyday quality of living. They spend a lot of time playing board games.
Yes.
At the time, I was a bit grumbly about it, but I keep coming back to it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, if anything, there's any thread which is going to connect both the books and our conversation before that is the depth of relationships. So I think with Eleanor Oliphant, she knows people, she has colleagues, and she sees people on the bus and in shops and stuff, and her dental hygienist. But of course, they're just very superficial, very shallow relationships. And likewise in Ivan Illyich, he has family members even who he married because he feels he has to, and all of his friends are there because they look good. It's all about decorum and looking the right part. And with Death and the Penguin, again, he lives on his own with a penguin. He has no real meaningful relationships. And then we're talking about Waiting for Godot earlier. The two main characters, Vladimir and Estragon, they have a really deep relationship. I think it's really important. That's why I said that it's unsure whether it's a happy or a sad play, because while they are waiting for Godot, while they're in limbo, these two have a really good friendship. With Eleanor Oliphant, I think that happens when she meets Raymond. It's a really important depth of relationship. And as a society, I think we're lacking that, aren't we? Most of my deep, meaningful relationships and friendships today are those which were formed either at school or at university. And you kind of think, why is it so hard to form meaningful relationships in adulthood? And it's because you don't have the time to invest in those relationships. And it's the downtime, it's the waiting for Godot moments. It's the moments where you're bored out of your mind and you're doing nothing but prattling around making up games or playing board games or just forging relationships in the downtime of boredom. I've tried to find a philosophy about that and I haven't found it yet. I've desperately looked for this idea, or a psychological or a philosophical idea, that relationships are formed only when you have essentially the waiting for Godot boredom. But maybe I need to reread my Beckett. Maybe that's what I need to do.
I think the fact that we're all digitally so busy all the time doesn't help. I think that gets in the way, definitely. Interesting, actually, you saying about trying to find someone who's looked at this idea and not being able to find anything. I read a book recently called Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma, by an author called Claire Dederer. That was really interesting because she was trying to figure out what to do with her feelings about art, meaning cultural things that had been made and that she loved by men with incredibly problematic real-life biographies. So the primary person that triggered this for her was Roman Polanski, whose films she thinks are absolutely extraordinary. I'm not really much of a film person, so that was all a bit lost on me.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Chinatown is the one she said is generally considered to be one of the finest films ever made. And she personally really loves these films, but struggles with her knowledge that in real life he raped a 13-year-old girl. And there's no getting away from that. And she was trying to find someone who could help her resolve what she saw as this contradiction between her feelings about the art and her knowledge about the person who had created the art. And she couldn't. She was looking around and there just wasn't really anyone who'd really tackled it in a way that she found helpful. And so she ended up writing this book. She was originally writing a book about Polanski, and she ended up writing this book, which is more about, she realized in a way she was trying to write a biography of an audience. She's writing about the viewer, us, we. What do we think? How do we respond? What do we do with these feelings? So it's a very immediately engaging personal book because it feels like it's tapping into these common concerns. You know, Woody Allen, Annie Hall, Manhattan Murder Mystery, one of my all-time favourites. Yes. But Woody Allen, really quite problematic in lots of ways. how do we square these things away? Michael Jackson, the music of Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
There's some fascinating authors that she looks at. Hemingway, Awful Man, Picasso. Really surprised me the degree to which she made me reevaluate what I thought about Picasso, because my entire life, and I've studied art history, I've very much been taught to approach him on the level of the work.
Yes.
And not really to think too much about him as a man. Whereas she flips it around and then is like, and now how do you feel about the work? I was like, yeah, not sure I feel the same.
Yeah.
So it's so interesting. But I loved it as an essay, I think, in the best sense of the word, in that, you know, trying out ideas, exploring some concepts, inviting discussion, inviting debate.
It sounds fascinating. I mean, there must be some tipping point, because essentially any writer before the 19th century has some problematic opinion. We don't cancel Shakespeare when Shylock is a desperately anti-Semitic character in The Merchant of Venice. If that was written today, then that would be enough to completely cancel him and all of his work. But we don't. How much do we allow, and how distant in the past does it have to be before we start saying it's problematic to the rest of their work?
She says, I told myself that Polanski was a genius, and that was all there was to it. Problem solved. But as I watched, I couldn't ignore something that seemed disturbingly akin to a twinge. More than a twinge, truth be told. My conscience was bothering me. The spectre of Polanski's crime wouldn't leave the room. I found I couldn't solve the problem of Roman Polanski by thinking. The poet William Empson said that life involves maintaining oneself between contradictions that can't be solved by analysis. I found myself in the midst of one of those contradictions. Polanski would be no problem for the viewer at all. Just another example of how some men happen to be black holes if the films were bad, but they're not. So that is my recommendation for... Yeah. I mean, is that philosophy?
No, absolutely. I need to read that. I mean, it raises... I mean, linking back to the mini-philosophy book, there's an entry about Clifford, about the ethics of belief. What responsibility is there on the reader to go away and research what the author is like as a person? Can you read naively a book without at any point investigating what the author was like as a person? No, I don't think you can. There's some funny things, aren't there? Imagine a quotation said by someone completely different, and it takes on a completely different flavour. Never stop trying. If it was said by Adolf Hitler, you'd be like, this is disgusting, don't ever do it and stuff with it. But if it was said by some kind of Olympian, you'd be like, brilliant, never stop trying. But then what onus is there on you as the listener or the reader or the watcher to go away and say, okay, well, let me find out what the intentions were behind that thing.
The other book I wanted to flag up, I read it last summer, and there was some thought that we might do an interview with the authors. And in fact, I think what happened is that they're both academics. I think the new term started and it just slightly fell by the wayside. But I read it last summer, and it was no small feat to read this book for me, just because I'm not the cleverest person in the world. And in some ways, it deals with some quite academic aspects of philosophy, I think. And that is Metaphysical Animals, How Four Women Brought Philosophy Back to Life, by Rachel Wiseman and Claire McCool. They are looking at four women philosophers, Mary Midgley, Philippa Foot, Iris Murdoch. So I knew Iris Murdoch as an author. I didn't know about her as philosopher, which was like her main thing. And I think the books were sort of, I mean, they weren't like a sideline. They became a very big part of her work. But the two aspects of her career were very closely intertwined. And Elizabeth Anscombe, who might not, apart from Murdoch, be names that anyone has heard of. And one of the big arguments of this book is that these women's names should be known and their work should be known. And one of the things it's tapping into is the reasons why. You know, it's not that women don't have ideas or thoughts or want to express them. It's that throughout history, their views have tended to be marginalised and tucked away, and that these academic fields have traditionally always been dominated by men. I love this little thing from their introduction. They say, the history of European philosophy is usually the story of the ideas, visions, hopes and fears of men. It's also the story of the ideas, visions, hopes and fears of men who have, in the main, lived unusually isolated lives away from women and children. Practically all the great European philosophers have been bachelors, wrote the philosopher Mary Midgley in 1953. This was the first line of a script for a radio talk commissioned by the BBC but rejected. Mary's observation concerning the marital status of philosophers was a trivial, irrelevant intrusion of domestic matters into intellectual life, said the producer. But Mary argued that the solipsism, scepticism and individualism that is characteristic of the Western philosophical tradition would not feature in a philosophy written by people who had shared intimate friendships with spouses and lovers, been pregnant, raised children, and enjoyed rich, full and varied human lives. And I love that. That completely captured me. I was very like, oh, yes, I really do want to read about these women. And then it sailed me through this book. I love the way it told their stories. It very much put their work in the context of their lives. They were able to flourish because it was just after the war, when basically most of the men who had held sway for so long were called away, they were fighting or they were involved in the war, and suddenly there was then this space that these women were able to come into. And then as a result, having that bit more visibility, I think they were able then to maintain this more vocal public position. But it was always a struggle. Yeah. And this book is about that struggle and about their ideas. It was such an interesting read.
That's fantastic. No, I like Mary Midgley a lot, and I absolutely agree with what she said there. I mean, essentially, if she's working in a kind of post-war philosophical environment, then the French in particular started this movement towards what it actually feels like to be a human being. And if you're talking about what it feels like to be a human being, you can't discount more than 50% of the population. One of the criticisms I get for my account is that I don't mention women philosophers enough. I don't consciously deny or deliberately try to avoid women, but the problem is because women have been so marginalised for so much in history, if you're explaining the history of ideas, the history of philosophy, you inevitably have to explain the white men's ideas before you come to the women's additions to it. So let's take Anscombe, for example, in that list. She's an Aristotelian virtue ethicist. She talks brilliantly about virtue theory and ethics. But if you're going to discuss her ideas, as you came across in the book, they come across as very scholarly and very advanced because to understand them fully, you have to go back and read Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. So on my account, I have to try to explain the white men first before I could even hope to unpack Anscombe or Murdoch. I agree, it's a problem in the history of philosophy. But it's a hard problem to resolve today if you're hoping to do philosophy or explain philosophy. So like, if I was trying to write, like I came across in the mini philosophy book, I tried my best to include non-Western and women philosophers in the book. But it's still 70-30. It's probably even worse than that, actually, to be honest. Because if I'm explaining philosophy and I'm introducing you to philosophy, I can't avoid Aristotle, Kant, David Hume, René Descartes. It comes to the women later on, and the women are present, but feature only as addendums to the white men. There's a great book called Philosopher Queens. I think it was published by Unbound, and it's written by 10 or 15 philosophers today, women philosophers, and they then write a biography and explanation of a female philosopher. So I do recommend if anyone wants to know about female philosophers, they are out there, and that's a great book to read that.
Well, we've talked about a lot of books in this episode, but let's come to your new book, which is called Mini Big Ideas. Tell us about that.
Essentially, these are ideas which have changed the course of human history. I'm very interested in the idea that what we're doing right now, for example, the arts, the humanities, and just thinking things through are massively important to who we are as a species. The way I define a big idea in the book is that it has to have a before time, a capital B, capital T. You have to imagine a world before that idea came along and how radically different it is to where we are today. Some people listening to this will remember the before time of the internet. They'll remember days when we had Encarta on a CD or we had to have the Britannica on our walls. We didn't have Google Maps, we had the AI Atlas and things. So they remembered the before time, and of course the internet is the big idea which changed that. But then the same is also true for penicillin, radio, light. I talk about cultural things like the novel. It's interesting we were talking earlier about women. One of the things coming up in researching for the book for Big Ideas is that the novel is essentially a woman's form. It was popularised because women were writing it, people like Jane Austen. But also it's about everyday life. It's about a micro-examination of what it is to be a person in a context. Whereas before that, it was essentially big epics. You have Iliad, you have the Old Testament, you have Beowulf and things like that. And then the novel comes along, which is a character assessment, and the argument's been made that the novel is essentially about a life, and therefore women really massively propelled the novel as a medium. So essentially it explores those and it explains them, it says why they're relevant, and it does so in a slightly wry way that I tend to do my Instagram accounts.
Yes, I was enjoying it. I enjoyed learning that I share 50% of my DNA with a banana.
Yes.
That was one of my little takeaways.
The science sections were really hard. I'm lucky in my life to have a few friends who've got PhDs in X, Y and Z. And I've got 2 friends who are physicists. There's 12 entries on physics. We're talking about dark matter, special relativity and heliocentrism and stuff. And that was, I thought philosophy was bad. Almost every sentence I wrote in the physics section, one of my friends would say, well, actually, this isn't the case. It depends. It depends on your perspective. It depends upon who's watching. It depends upon what you're looking for. And yeah, physics, especially theoretical physics, is philosophy. I loved it. There's 150 ideas, and there are certain themes which emerge throughout all of the chapters. And one of them is how you need essentially many different factors to happen at the same time for an idea to pick off. So a great example of this is the steam engine. My son is obsessed with steam engines. And actually, when you look at the mechanisms of a steam chain, it's actually really straightforward. You're boiling water, which makes steam, which is then going towards some system which pushes something or creates some power. But what was lacking was 2 things. One is a technological advancement and one was a sociological one. And the technological one is we hadn't got a metal which was strong or well forged enough to make a pressure container, which then funnels the steam to a piston, which would pull a train, or some kind of pipes which would extract water in a well. So that was the technological, and that only comes around in the Industrial Revolution, where we have better methods of making steel and essentially better metals. And everyone was sociological. The Romans had steam power, but they didn't need to because they had slaves and horses. At what point does it become economical and useful to have steam power? And that's the Industrial Revolution, when we have to make vast amounts of things. And most importantly, at the time in Britain, it used to be we had to extract water from all the mines we were doing. And so the first major steam machine is a steam water extractor. So that comes up a lot. It happens with radio, happens with Gutenberg's printing press. These ideas, they only work because lots of other things come in at the same time.
So that's just out. Before I let you go, there was one thing I wanted to ask you, which is, if there was one philosophical idea that you think is most useful in helping people get through life, what would it be?
What helps, I think, a lot of people is something called, it's from Stoicism really, it's called the gap. And actually it's popularised by Viktor Frankl, who was this Holocaust surviving writer, who talks about this moment where, if we're essentially having an experience in life, there is a very small gap, infinitesimally small it might be, where you get to decide how you're going to respond to that experience. And most of us completely gloss over that gap. We kind of just talk over it, or we experience an anger or maybe love or attraction to that. But then he says that there is a moment, there's a pause between that where you can decide how you're going to respond to it. I think it's really important. It's essential to Stoicism, this idea of this called the dichotomy of control. You know, what can you control, what can't you control? And I think you can control your response to the world. So let's say you called me something really rude. I would have a gap to how I respond to that, and I can decide, I'm not going to rise. I'm going to decide to be like this to it. And this is actually the basis for cognitive behavioural therapy as well, which is really popular and really effective today. So that's the kind of thing which I think that most people might enjoy. But what worked for me personally, I'm really attracted to scepticism, ancient scepticism as a philosophy. It's consciously accepting the fact that I will never know the answer to most things. I live my life like that, and I feel much more relaxed and comfortable in that. Particularly in politics, if I'm listening to two people debate, I'll agree with whoever's talking the most. Or even around at a dinner table, if people have really good arguments, I will like, oh, yeah, that's right. No, you're right. And of course, writing a book like Mini Philosophy and Mega Big Ideas, you come across that all the time. I used to think that this is bad. I've got many different ideas. I should stick to one ideology, one philosophy, and keep to that. But actually, now I'm much more relaxed, accepting that there's probably many answers, and they're all, if not equally valid, they're acceptable positions. And I'm happier knowing that. We'll never know the answer, and I like just dancing in this kind of grey zone in between knowing. So yeah, ancient skepticism I would recommend to people. Let go of trying to know everything.
I think that's what underpins the Claire Dederer book that I loved so much, because it holds you in this state of uncertainty, but ultimately at the end, I mean, I don't want to spoil it, but maybe it's not too much of a spoiler to say there isn't some binary answer. Yeah. It's really just about exploring the question, and she proposes something at the end that I really loved and responded to, which is actually about the nature of the human heart. She quotes this wonderful W.H. Auden line, "The desires of the heart are as crooked as corkscrews." I've loved talking to you today.
Thank you.
And I love Philosophy Minis. They are nuggets of something that feels real to me. When I first came across them, I was like, oh, this is almost weird to say something tangible in this digital form, but these ideas that lodge with you and you take away and you think about. And so it was great to be able to talk to you about them in person.
Thank you so much.
That's nearly it for this episode. Books mentioned were On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Road by Cormac McCarthy, The Life and Death of Ivan Illyich by Leo Tolstoy, and in particular the Peter Carson translation, Death and the Penguin by Andrei Kurkov, Super Infinite, The Transformations of John Donne by Katherine Rundell, Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman, Leonard and Hungry Paul by Rónán Hession, Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma by Claire Dederer, Metaphysical Animals by Rachel Wiseman and Claire McCall, Philosopher Queens by Rebecca Buxton and Lisa Whiting, and Jonny's latest book, Mini Big Ideas, available now. And you can also find him on Instagram @PhilosophyMinis. This episode of the Book Club Review was edited and produced by me, Kate Slothover, here in London. If you enjoyed it and want to support us in return, we now have a couple of ways you can do that. One free way is to share your appreciation, whether that's posting about us on social media, telling your friends and family, or leaving us a review, all of which helps us reach more listeners. Or you can sign up to our shiny new Patreon account, where you'll find a couple of options for supporting us financially. Top-tier subscribers will get to join our new monthly book club. So have a look and see if it's something you'd like to do. We'd love to have you on board. You'll find it at patreon.com/The Book Club Review. Between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on X at Book Club RVW Pod, or get in touch direct at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. Plus, if you want a peek into my reading diary, you'll find that at Book Club Review over on Threads. But for now, thanks for listening and happy book clubbing.